It's been a rather rough week for law enforcement officers, not just in Dallas, in Minnesota, and Baton Rouge, Louisiana, but also around the nation. Of course, now we've had an incident in our nation's capital. Law enforcement officers there are coming under fire. Many are starting to look inward at some of the practices of their own police department. Joining us now to help give us more insight into this recent developments is Attorney Antonio Romanucci, joining us from his offices in Chicago. He's worked in this capacity now for some time and has worked in helping some victims of police misconduct as he represents them in court. Antonio, it's certainly been a rough few days and a rough week here for police officers. I know Chicago has struggled with some of these similar incidents in recent days as well.
Good afternoon, and thank you for allowing me to be on the show today. Yes, it has been a rough week. I mean, really, if you look at this past, several days in our nation, I think we're going to look back at this period of time and say this was historic. Not in the good sense, but in the sense that there's so much going on right now that we really have to take a step back, evaluate, and we have to redefine ourselves not only as a people, but also as a culture. Who do we want to be remembered as?
There's a lot of talk about whether or not there's racial bias, whether or not there's systemic racial bias in the way that police officers conduct themselves, especially in some big cities. Have you seen evidence of that, and how would you characterize the interactions of police in Chicago or in other cities that you have worked with?
Well, if you look at my home base here in Chicago, I don't think there's any doubt that there's racial bias when it comes to policing. There's a significant lawsuit that we have filed here on behalf of African Americans. It's a stop and frisk lawsuit, as it's commonly known, where we're alleging that over 70% of the stops that police make in order to ascertain whether or not there are weapons or drugs or guns, anything of that nature, are people of color who are stopped. And African Americans do not make up 70% of the population here in Chicago, although the police argue that that's where the crime is and that's where they need to make the stops. But the numbers don't show that. So I believe very strongly that there is a racial bias when it comes to policing. There's a profiling, and it's not only here, but I also see it in other parts of the country too.
Of course, you've just had a new police chief and a sort of a change, a transition of power there in the police department, a lot of reform in the works as officials there look to engage with members of the community and look to improve in their policing as well. But in Dallas now, that's a police department that is certainly grieving. A tough day for them as they look to one another for strength and for support, and a nation sheds and tears with them and reaches out for outpouring with them. But the Dallas Police Department has been widely recognized and acknowledged for doing a fantastic job at engaging the community, reaching out, asking members of the community how they would like to be policed. Are those some characteristics, some traits that you'd like to see other police departments also embrace?
Absolutely. I think what you've seen in Dallas, and when you look at how much time it's taken Dallas in order to reach the level of trust that they have now, that that the community has in them. It's been about 12 or 15 years. And that's the sort of trust that we need, not only here in Chicago, but across the country. So what happened in Dallas should not have happened, anywhere. I don't believe that any police officer, should have been shot at or killed at all. But when you look at what Dallas has done over the past 15 years in developing that community policing, where their interaction and their boots on the ground with the people, that's the type of trust that heals community and builds trust and actually reduces violence. And that's what we need here in Chicago.
A lot has been made about, and a lot of casual observers look at one moment in time, and there's always the knee-jerk reaction. But as you pointed out, it took 10 to 15 years for Dallas to improve to the point where they are now. And many who have studied this for their careers will tell you that many of the underlying tensions that exist didn't happen overnight. They've been a work in progress, and it's taken a long time to get to where we are today. But you mentioned about dialing down tensions and reducing violence. What kind of a message does it send to citizens or to residents of any city when their police are clad in riot gear, when police have heavily armed, almost tanks and these armored vehicles strolling down the streets through protest, and you see much of the same military-type gear that you'd see in Fallujah or that you'd see in Kabul right here on our own streets?
That's a great question because that is certainly a hotbed issue right now. Should the police be policing or should they actually be peace officers? The militarization of our police right now, as you just described it, actually escalates many situations because when you put an individual, such as a police officer, in a situation where he is in riot gear, they're in armored tanks, they're delivering bombs by robots, it develops a military mentality of kill first, as opposed to being a peace officer, which I believe is what policing should be first, and then doing the military part way down the line. If you try to create peace first by de-escalating violent situations, and I'm not talking about Dallas specifically right now, but in general, you will work much more towards gaining respect and community trust, and therefore, bringing the circle back of reducing violence. Because if you have trust within the community and the police, you won't have these Dallas incidents. You won't have people who want to do very bad things to people who are there to protect us.
You mentioned earlier the stop and frisk practices of many have come under question, under scrutiny, with racial tensions there. I do want to point really quickly to a Harvard economist, celebrated Harvard economist, Roland Fryer. He happens to be an African American. He came out with a study and he said it was one of the most surprising findings of his entire career. And that was that there was no racial bias that he could detect in the use of lethal force from police officers. In fact, he said it was more likely for officers to pull the trigger against a white suspect. However, he said that in non-lethal cases, it did tend to be that police officers were more likely to get physical with African American suspects, whether that was handcuffing them, shoving them against the wall, or taking them down to the ground. So there did seem to be sort of a difference in the way the police officers found. He looked at over 1,300 cases in 10 major police departments in California, in Texas, and in Florida. How would you square that with many of the cases that you have seen, and would you be able to add any context to why this may be the case?
Well, I'm not going to come out and disagree with his findings because I haven't read the totality of his findings with respect to deadly force. However, what I would say is that skin color does matter, and it seems to me that police pull the trigger much quicker when it is somebody of color than when somebody is not of color. When you shift the focus now to non-uses of deadly force, when it comes to excessive force, then clearly you do see a pattern which we know that does exist, where it seems to be that skin color does matter, and it should not matter. Policing should be standardized. And I think, I saw that, our presumptive candidate Hillary Clinton talk about a nationalized police procedure standpoint on the use of force and deadly force, which I think would be a very good start because we have too many different rules across the country that aren't being followed on a routine basis, and people get stopped, they get hurt unnecessarily as a result.
Of course, police do have a very difficult job and work in a tense environment, especially this entire escalation of hostilities, if you will, or tensions has been putting a lot of law enforcement officers on edge as they put on the badge and go out for a very dangerous job, as it can always be. Tonight, Attorney Antonio Romanucci joining us again from his offices in Chicago. Antonio, thanks.
Thank you very much. Have a good day.